What if the very country that once embraced you with open arms suddenly turned its back? Not with a headline, not with a press release, but with a quiet, calculated no that echoed louder than any royal scandal. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. That's exactly what happened to Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. Australia, a land where they were once adored, idolized, even. A place where the Sussex fairy tale seemed untouchable. And now, the gates have closed. The invitation isn't coming. The answer is final. No royal tour. No triumphant return. No applause. And behind palace walls in Montecito, behind the California sunshine and curated smiles, Meghan was reportedly in tears. This wasn't just a cancellation. This was rejection. And worse, it was personal. But to truly understand the weight of this snub, to grasp why this decision cut so deeply, we need to rewind to where it all began. Back to the golden days. The magic. The illusions. The 2018 Royal Tour of Australia. Because here's the twist. This wasn't just any tour. This was the tour. It was the beginning of everything. The rise, the love affair, the branding of Harry and Meghan as more than royals, as global icons. It was the moment they captured the hearts of the world and announced Meghan's pregnancy in front of a roaring Commonwealth audience. It was, quite literally, their shining debut as the monarchy's fresh new face. And now, the very soil that birthed their superstardom wants nothing to do with them. How did we get here? How did it unravel? And what don't we know about the phone calls, letters, and quiet behind-the-scenes negotiations that led to this moment? A moment where the Duchess of Sussex sat in stunned silence, realizing the country that once chanted her name was done with her. You might think it's just politics or palace drama, but no, this goes deeper. This rejection is layered, a tangle of history, ambition, betrayal, and timing. Because while the Sussexes built a kingdom of content in California, the Commonwealth kept watching and judging. And Australia? Australia made its move. A decision was made. A line was drawn, and Meghan, for all her PR teams, Netflix deals, and public speeches, couldn't fix it. What's more, Harry didn't see it coming either. And for him, this rejection cuts even deeper. Because Australia isn't just another tour location. It's not just another press cycle. For Prince Harry, Australia holds something sacred. A personal connection, a legacy tied to his mother, Princess Diana, and a bond with veterans through his Invictus Games that he thought would never break. But it did. Quietly. Coldly. And the worst part? No one picked up the phone. There was no explanation. Just silence. So now, they're left asking, is this the beginning of the end for their global influence? Because make no mistake, when a Commonwealth country shuts the door, others listen. The rejection of the Sussexes from Australia isn't just about one tour being denied. It's a warning shot. It signals something bigger, a recalibration of public tolerance, a reassessment of relevance. And while Meghan and Harry continue to build their narrative from Montecito, it seems the world outside isn't playing along. Now, here's what we're going to uncover in this story. The untold drama behind the 2018 Australia tour. The royal staff tensions that started there and never healed. How Meghan's carefully curated PR efforts couldn't withstand shifting public opinion. Why the Australian government, under pressure from multiple sides, said no, and why it matters. The emotional fallout inside the Sussex household. And the final, agonizing twist. A private outreach from Meghan herself that was quietly, decisively ignored. But there's one more reason this story matters. A reason few are willing to say aloud. Harry and Meghan built their post-royal brand on nostalgia, on the echo of the public love they received in those early days. That adoring 2018 crowd in Sydney, those cheers, that warmth. It's the foundation of the entire Sussex brand. And now, that foundation has cracked. Because if Australia, the very country that celebrated them, has moved on, who else will? What happens to Harry and Meghan when the doors stop opening? When the cameras stop caring? When a return tour becomes a diplomatic liability? It raises a more chilling question. Have Harry and Meghan finally reached the point where even nostalgia can't save them? And if so, what's left? Fame? Netflix? Or just the empty echo of what could have been? Because behind the palace walls and Montecito gates, a new chapter is being written, And this one doesn't begin with a red carpet welcome. It begins with a rejection and ends with a reckoning. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happens when a love story becomes a political statement? When a fairy tale unfolds in real time under the brutal glare of a billion eyes. But with cameras just out of frame, recording moments that never make it into the narrative? That's what Australia was for Meghan and Harry in 2018. On the surface, it was magic. On paper, a dream tour. But as with all dreams, the moment you wake up, you realize things were never quite what they seemed. The first time Meghan stepped off that plane in Sydney, sleek bun, custom-designed dress, radiant smile, it wasn't just another royal engagement. It was a performance. And the audience? Wild. Screaming. Euphoric. This wasn't just curiosity. This was love at first sight. Australians, known for their casual irreverence toward royalty, seemed enchanted. They waved banners, threw flowers, shouted her name. Not his, hers. Meghan mania had landed in the southern hemisphere. And Harry? He beamed, yes. But there was already a flicker of something else in his eyes. Something that no one quite noticed then, but would mean everything later. The 2018 Royal Tour of Australia wasn't just symbolic. It was historic. It was Harry and Meghan's first major overseas tour as newlyweds, fresh from the global spectacle of their Windsor wedding. But more importantly, it was their test. The first public indication of how they would operate as a duo, as a brand, as a modern power couple under the crown. The palace wanted polished diplomacy. The public wanted glamour and warmth. The press wanted quotes and drama. Meghan and Harry gave them all of it. And for 16 whirlwind days, it worked. Or so we thought. In just over 2 weeks, they visited cities like Sydney, Melbourne, and Dubbo. They shook thousands of hands, hugged children, walked barefoot on the beach, fed kangaroos, sat with farmers in drought. Meghan gave heartfelt speeches that seemed effortless, too effortless, some behind-the-scenes whispered. Her background as an actress was seen not as an asset, but as a potential liability. Because when you're a working royal, charisma is welcome, but control is required. And Meghan? She wasn't interested in playing second fiddle to anyone, not even protocol. Still, in public, everything sparkled. Australians couldn't get enough. Local headlines praised her fashion, her poise, her emotional accessibility. Women cried when she touched their hands. Men waved signs that said, "We love you, Meg." Even cynical outlets published glowing features. One young girl in Melbourne was so overwhelmed at meeting Meghan that she burst into tears, and Meghan, without missing a beat, knelt down, wiped the child's cheeks, and whispered something that made the girl smile again. That photo alone was shared millions of times across the world. Meghan, pregnant, glowing, confident, was becoming the new face of the monarchy. And Harry? He watched with pride. And maybe something else. Something tighter in his chest. Because the truth was, this tour was Meghan's coronation, not Harry's. The real bombshell dropped just hours after their arrival. Kensington Palace issued a short, carefully worded press release. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex were expecting their first child. The timing was no accident. The pregnancy announcement hijacked the headlines and added even more sparkle to the already electric trip. But not everyone was clapping. Behind palace walls, the reaction was frosty. Sources later admitted the Queen was surprised by the timing of the announcement. Some courtiers viewed it as an ambush, a PR maneuver that took the spotlight away from Princess Eugenie's wedding just days earlier. Meghan and Harry had turned the tour into a double feature, diplomatic duties and a personal victory lap. It thrilled the public. It infuriated the institution. But down in Australia, the crowds didn't care. Meghan's bump became the star of the show. People brought gifts. Little teddy bears, onesies, flowers. Australian media gushed over her maternal glow. She delivered speeches on mental health and women's empowerment with perfect pacing, eye contact, and just enough vulnerability to feel authentic. Even seasoned reporters commented that Meghan outshone the traditional royal mold, and they meant it as a compliment. The tour was a home run. Or was it? Because behind the scenes, staff members were breaking. Literally. One aide, according to multiple reports, burst into tears after a confrontation with Meghan. Another quit before the tour was even over. The term Hurricane Meghan began to circulate in hushed tones among staff. Complaints of 5 a.m. texts, impossible demands, last-minute schedule changes. The palace communications team was under siege, trying to spin the media frenzy without losing control. Meghan was praised in public and allegedly scolding in private. Harry, fiercely protective of her, clashed with staff. Tensions mounted. Lines were drawn. But none of this made the headlines. At least not yet. To the public eye, the Sussexes were riding high. Every beach walk, every koala photo op, every baby gift added to the mythos. Meghan wore both local and high-end designers. Her wardrobe became a fashion event in itself. She nailed the balance between regal and relatable. One day she wore sneakers. The next, heels that cost $1,200. Australians didn't mind. They saw it as part of the fairy tale. But the monarchy did. Sources later claimed that the palace grew concerned by the level of adoration. Meghan and Harry weren't just performing well, they were dominating, even overshadowing the rest of the family. Senior courtiers began to view the Sussexes not as rising stars, but as a potential rogue state. And Australia, so far away, so independent in its attitude, had become their proving ground. A place where Meghan could test the waters of full-scale royal stardom, without the constraints of London. There was one moment, a seemingly small one, that still lingers. In Dubbo, during a rainstorm, Harry gave a speech about mental health and resilience. He broke down slightly. His voice wavered. The audience clapped. Meghan stepped forward, took his hand, and silently stood beside him. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, she became his anchor. And to many watching, she became the emotional center of their partnership. That moment was replayed on television screens around the world. Modern royals, the headlines read. A couple for the 21st century. But the rain that day? It wasn't just metaphorical. It foreshadowed something darker. Because for all their public success, the crowds, the photos, the global attention, the cracks had begun. Staff morale was at an all-time low. The palace had concerns about Meghan's approach to press strategy, too controlling, too direct, too American. Harry was becoming more withdrawn from his brother. William, back in the UK, was allegedly deeply concerned about the direction things were going. Meghan's sense of purpose, so clear, so confident, was starting to look less like modern royalty and more like Hollywood ambition. The palace doesn't reward ambition. It punishes it. The tour ended on a high note, at least publicly. The couple waved goodbye, glowing, triumphant. They boarded the plane back to London as international darlings. Meghan was pregnant. Harry was in love. The Commonwealth adored them. Australia had embraced them like family. But not everyone was cheering. In the weeks that followed, something shifted. Stories began to leak. Anonymous quotes from palace insiders. Words like demanding, diva, difficult. Rumors swirled of staff exodus, of royal fury over the pregnancy reveal, of William's growing suspicion, of aides near breaking point. And suddenly, the dream was over. What had seemed like the beginning of a new royal era was actually the beginning of the end. Because that tour, that shimmering, sunlit celebration of Sussex promise, had lit a fire. And back in Australia, where it had all unfolded so beautifully, something began to cool. The country watched. Time passed. Oprah happened. Netflix happened. The Queen died. Charles ascended. And slowly, silently, Australia made up its mind. Not with a headline. Not with a press release. Just a quiet no. And Meghan? She never saw it coming. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the very trip that crowned you also quietly cursed you? Because while millions watched Meghan and Harry waving from balconies and cradling koalas, backstage, far from the polished smiles and cheering crowds, something darker was brewing. The 2018 Australian tour didn't just make headlines. It made enemies. And the real story? It didn't play out in the public square. It played out behind closed hotel doors, in hushed radio calls, in frantic staff meetings that the press never heard about. Until now. Let's go back to the early morning routines of that tour. The cameras weren't rolling yet. The public hadn't gathered. But Meghan was already awake, sending texts. Lots of them. According to multiple sources, she would message staff as early as 5 a.m. sharp instructions. Outfit adjustments. Talking point tweaks. Sometimes even full speech rewrites. On the surface, it sounds proactive, a hard-working duchess eager to perfect her duties. But behind palace protocol, this was unheard of. Royal staff are used to structure, hierarchy, flow, not rapid-fire demands from someone still new to the system. And certainly not from a duchess bypassing traditional channels of communication. At first, aides tried to keep up. They smiled, nodded, and adjusted. But it didn't take long before the strain began to show. One staffer reportedly broke down in tears after being scolded for a minor logistical error involving a car arrival. Another claimed Meghan changed her schedule without consulting the appropriate regional liaisons, leaving security in a scramble. Aides were burning out, and fast. What was supposed to be a dazzling global tour was turning into a pressure cooker, the kind that left people exhausted, confused, and silently seething. But you wouldn't know any of that from the photos, because every time the Sussexes stepped out, flawless. Meghan's smile, impeccable. Harry's hand on her back, reassuring. Every shot looked like it belonged in a movie poster. But that's the danger of optics. They don't reveal the storm happening just out of frame. Let's talk about the now infamous quote. One anonymous staffer told the Times of London, "I was shaking with anger. I wanted to cry." This wasn't an isolated feeling. Other reports followed, all echoing similar themes. Meghan was demanding, dismissive, and above all, unaware of the emotional toll she was inflicting on her team. These weren't tabloid leaks. These came from within the palace machine itself, and they all traced back to Australia. What's important here isn't just that tensions existed. It's that the 2018 tour exposed a fundamental clash of cultures. Meghan, an American actress accustomed to direct communication, quick pivots, and owning her public image, walked into a centuries-old institution built on deference, diplomacy, and discretion. What she saw as efficiency, others saw as entitlement. What she interpreted as taking initiative, others viewed as crossing lines. And Harry? He was caught in the middle, torn between loyalty to his wife and his role within the firm. According to insiders, he didn't handle it well. In one particularly heated moment, allegedly during the Fiji leg of the tour, Harry was seen scolding a staff member over what he called disrespectful behavior toward Meghan. The exchange was never captured on camera, but the fallout was felt. The aide in question later resigned. Others began quietly updating their CVs. And the palace? It went into damage control mode. But the deeper issue wasn't just a few frazzled assistants. It was the fact that this tour, meant to unify and elevate the Sussexes, was starting to fracture the institution. Meghan was carving out her space, her voice, her identity, and the system wasn't prepared for it. It was also around this time that Meghan's relationship with the press began to shift. Initially, the media was enchanted. They praised her outfits, her eloquence, her ability to connect. But slowly, the tone began to change. Subtle at first, headlines began using words like diva and pushy. British tabloids hinted at tension behind the scenes. One article asked, "Is Meghan too Hollywood for the House of Windsor?" It was a loaded question, and one that would haunt her for years to come. But here's the most shocking part. While the public was busy fawning over baby gifts and romantic glances, the palace was already preparing a contingency plan. There were whispers, hushed but present, about reassessing future tours, about tightening media access, about shifting focus away from the Sussexes for the next Commonwealth engagements. All of it was triggered by what happened behind the curtain in Australia. And still, the Sussexes smiled. Because Meghan and Harry understood something that the palace underestimated. Image is power. And so, even as staff members cracked and internal emails circulated warning of unmanageable expectations, the couple continued to build their brand. One appearance at a time, one speech, one photo, one carefully angled smile. There was one particular day, in Tonga, that drew attention. Meghan wore a vibrant red dress that immediately went viral. She looked stunning, but it was later discovered that a security protocol had been broken during that visit. The detail was minor, but telling. Meghan's team had reportedly requested media placement that deviated from the pre-approved setup. Why? To control the shot. To make sure her entrance was captured from the perfect angle. Again, it sounds harmless. But in royal terms, it was a red flag. A warning sign that this wasn't a duchess playing by the rulebook. This was someone rewriting it. And someone at the palace didn't like that. In fact, by the time the tour wrapped up, at least 3 senior staff members had indicated their intention to leave. One insider reportedly said, "I've never seen anything like it. We were walking on eggshells every day." That tour, once hailed as a triumph, had become a battlefield of egos, expectations, and exhaustion. But no one dared say it publicly. Not yet. Because remember, this was 2018. The Sussex narrative was still soaring. The cracks weren't visible to the naked eye, but they were there. And those who were watching closely, those inside the system, could already feel it. Something had shifted, and not in a good way. So when people wonder why the Australian government recently rejected any proposal for a Sussex return tour, the answer doesn't start in 2024. It starts right here, in 2018. Because while the world saw a dazzling diplomatic success, insiders saw something else. They saw Meghan Markle, pregnant, polished, powerful, commanding the spotlight, owning the headlines, dismantling decades of tradition with a single, silent gaze into a child's eyes. And they saw the chaos she left in her wake, the exhausted aides, the panicked protocol officers, the royal institution clenching its teeth and praying it would all hold together. It did, barely. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. How do you go from national sweetheart to national headache? That's the question Meghan Markle and Prince Harry never thought they'd face in Australia. Because in 2018, this country adored them. The crowds were electric. The headlines gushed. Their every move, every whisper, every wardrobe choice was celebrated like it was royalty reborn. But fast forward a few years, and the tone couldn't be more different. What once was love has curdled into suspicion. Affection turned into mockery. Enthusiasm faded into resentment. And for Australia, a country that prides itself on spotting pretenders and cutting through pretense, the shift wasn't just emotional. It was seismic. Let's rewind. After the 2018 royal tour, Meghan and Harry left Australia as heroes. Their farewell was full of glowing editorials, morning show praise, and tearful goodbyes from fans who believed they'd witnessed something new, something hopeful. Meghan had become a symbol of modern royalty, multicultural, outspoken, accessible. Harry was the doting husband, finally healed from the trauma of his mother's death. Together, they were the royal couple for a new generation. But the cracks, small and ignored at first, began to grow. When the Oprah interview aired in 2021, everything changed. The world paused. Australia leaned in. And what it heard didn't sit well. Accusations of racism, allegations of cruelty, claims of abandonment. Meghan and Harry weren't just sharing their story, they were burning bridges. And for many Australians who had welcomed them with open arms, it felt like a betrayal. Why? Because Australians are proud of their independence, yes, but they also value loyalty. And while the country debates its future with the monarchy, there's still a deep cultural respect for Queen Elizabeth II. So when Meghan described the royal family as cold, uncaring, and even dangerous, it wasn't just scandalous. It felt like a personal insult to the legacy Australians had embraced for decades, especially when it came from someone they had once adored. The backlash was swift. Australian media, which once drooled over every outfit and gesture, suddenly turned. Sky News Australia became one of the most vocal critics, with anchors openly mocking Meghan's interviews, fact-checking her claims, and questioning her sincerity. Headlines called her divisive, tone-deaf, and self-pitying. Talk show hosts accused her of playing the victim while living in a $14 million mansion. The tone had shifted, and it wasn't subtle. Even morning shows that had previously fawned over the Sussexes now raised eyebrows. A well-known breakfast host asked bluntly, "Is this all just a Hollywood production?" Another called Harry lost and manipulated. These weren't fringe opinions. These were mainstream voices, reflecting a growing discomfort in a country that once celebrated them. But it wasn't just media. It was the public, too. Online forums, comment sections, radio call-ins. Suddenly, Australians were talking differently about the Sussexes. Polls began to show declining favorability. A 2022 survey showed that a majority of Australians had grown skeptical of Harry and Meghan's motives, with many labeling their actions as attention-seeking and disrespectful. And for veterans, it cut even deeper. Harry's Invictus Games were once a source of pride. He had visited wounded Australian soldiers. He had cried with them. He had honored them. But after the Oprah interview, some veterans felt abandoned. One Australian ex-soldier wrote in a national op-ed, "We supported Harry because he supported us. But now he's using his military past as a PR weapon. That's not service, that's spin." Even pro-Sussex voices began to hesitate. There was sympathy, sure. Empathy, even. But there was also fatigue. An exhaustion with the constant drama, the Netflix specials, the Spotify deals, the endless cycle of tell-alls and public grievances. And in a country like Australia, where tall poppy syndrome is real and humility is sacred, that fatigue turned into frustration. So when whispers began circulating that Meghan and Harry were eyeing another royal tour of Australia, the reaction wasn't excitement. It was confusion, then concern, and finally, resistance. Because here's what no one in the Sussex camp seemed to grasp. Time doesn't always heal wounds. Sometimes it exposes them. And while they had built a brand on victimhood, Australia had moved on. The pandemic reshaped priorities. Queen Elizabeth's death triggered reflection. Prince William and Princess Catherine, who visited the country with more traditional grace, were seen as safe, stable, and above all, silent. That silence, Australians respected it. Meghan's noise? They didn't. There's a term Australians use for those who wear out their welcome. Try hard. And increasingly, that's how Meghan and Harry were being described. Trying too hard to be relatable. Trying too hard to control the narrative. Trying too hard to stage comebacks when no one had asked for one. By 2024, the sentiment had solidified. Australia, once the site of their royal fairy tale, was now questioning why they should be invited back at all, especially when other members of the royal family hadn't stirred nearly as much controversy. And the most telling moment came not from a news anchor or political figure, but from a woman who had once camped overnight just to see Meghan wave from a car. She was interviewed again in 2023, asked if she'd do it all over again, sleep outside, hold a sign, cry tears of joy. She hesitated, then shook her head. She was beautiful. She was kind. But I don't know who she is anymore. That's the heartbreak of it. Australia didn't hate Meghan and Harry. Not at first. They just stopped believing in them. And in a world where perception is everything, that silence is more damning than any headline. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What does it mean when a government rejects royalty? Not just symbolically, not softly, but definitively, with cold precision. A quiet, strategic no that echoes louder than any scandal, any headline, any viral moment. That's exactly what the Australian government delivered. Not to the monarchy, but to two people who once embodied its evolution. Meghan and Harry didn't expect it. Not them. Not here. Not in Australia, the land that once screamed their names from balconies, that watched them cradle koalas and announce a royal baby with teary joy. But this time, no banners, no official welcome, no diplomatic outreach, just silence. And silence, in politics, is rarely empty. Let's unpack what really happened and why it matters. Sometime in early 2024, according to senior diplomatic sources and quietly leaked reports, a proposal had been informally floated. A return, a tour, not officially under the royal banner, because, of course, Meghan and Harry no longer work for the firm, but something close. A charity partnership tour, potentially linked to climate work, veterans' causes, or women's empowerment initiatives. A bridge between past and present. A royal comeback, without the crown. The Sussexes believed it had potential. Meghan's media team allegedly made soft inquiries through mutual contacts in Australian philanthropy circles. Harry's Invictus connections were tapped. A few entertainment and NGO figures were even approached with the idea of coordinating logistics. No firm dates. No contracts. Just whispers. But then, the door closed. Not with a bang, but with a very deliberate pivot. According to multiple sources close to Australian diplomatic channels, the government made its stance clear. There would be no official endorsement of any visit by the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. Not in any royal capacity. Not even in a soft diplomatic role. They were free to visit as private citizens, of course. But there would be no red carpet, no government co-hosting, no prime minister photo ops. In short, Australia was done. And behind that polite rejection, a storm of calculation. Because for Australia, this wasn't just about one couple. It was about optics, timing, stability, and control. Let's start with politics. The current Australian government, under increasing pressure to hold a new referendum on becoming a republic, is playing a delicate game. On one hand, they must maintain respectful ties with the monarchy, a structure still deeply woven into the Constitution. On the other, they must listen to a rising wave of Republican sentiment. Voters and activists who want the monarchy gone. Hosting Harry and Meghan, two figures who represent royal chaos and contradiction, would inflame both sides. To monarchists, it would be a slap in the face. A pair of rogue royals, ousted and self-exiled, being treated with reverence on Commonwealth soil. To Republicans, it would be a distraction, a celebrity sideshow muddying the waters of real constitutional reform. For the government, there was no upside. And then, there's loyalty. Australia still remembers Queen Elizabeth II with deep affection. Her decades of service, her consistent diplomatic demeanor, her unshakable commitment to neutrality. Hosting Meghan and Harry, who've used media platforms to criticize that very institution, would be interpreted as a political statement, one the Prime Minister wasn't willing to make. Even more telling, the internal memo. Leaked to a senior journalist at The Age, a draft government document indicated that the Duke and Duchess of Sussex are not considered suitable representatives for official engagement due to their non-aligned status with the Crown. The wording was clinical, but the message was lethal, and it didn't end there. Sources suggest that Buckingham Palace, quietly and without public notice, was informed of the government's stance, not because they were being asked to intervene, but as a courtesy, a diplomatic gesture. And the palace's response? Silence. No objections. No pushback. No gentle nudges on the Sussexes' behalf. Because in private, royal insiders were relieved. The palace doesn't want Meghan and Harry doing unofficial tours. It confuses the public. It blurs the lines of authority. And worst of all, it reopens wounds that were supposed to be buried under layers of royal silence. So when Australia said no, the palace didn't protest. They exhaled. Now here's the sting. Harry was reportedly devastated. He had hoped, naively, some say, that Invictus alone would be enough. That his work with veterans, his emotional connection to Australia's military community, would supersede politics. That the country he'd once bonded with so deeply would remember him for his service, not his scandals. But service, in the diplomatic world, has a shelf life. And Harry's shelf? It's rapidly expiring. Meghan, for her part, was furious. According to someone close to her camp, she interpreted the rejection as a coordinated snub, a direct result of pressure from Buckingham Palace. She believed Australia, especially under its progressive leadership, would embrace her work. Women's rights, mental health, diversity. She thought the country would see her as an evolved royal voice. But the country didn't see her that way anymore. They saw Netflix. They saw Oprah. They saw headlines. Meghan cries wolf. Harry betrays Queen's legacy. Sussexes cash in on trauma. They saw drama. And Australia, never known for patience with celebrity theatrics, made a choice. Not because they hate Meghan. Not because they've turned monarchist. But because they saw no benefit in reopening that chapter. Because while Harry and Meghan may live in Montecito, Australia still lives in the real world, a world of policy, diplomacy, public opinion, and headlines. And in that world, a Sussex tour equals distraction. So the door didn't just close. It locked. And the message was clear. You may once have been royal here, but you're not anymore. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What does rejection look like when you're living in a mansion? When you've stood before world leaders, spoken on global stages, graced magazine covers, and reshaped your entire identity around the power of visibility. What happens when the world simply doesn't look back? For Meghan Markle, the Australian government's decision wasn't just a political rebuff. It was a personal blow, a rejection not of her title, or her platform, or her itinerary, but of her, of the image she had worked tirelessly to cultivate since the day she first stepped into the royal spotlight. This wasn't just another door closing. This was the same door that had once swung open for her with a roar of applause and 1,000 waving flags. And now? Silence. Stillness. Nothing. When the news came in, It didn't explode in a media frenzy. There was no dramatic headline, no furious letter, just quiet word from a well-placed contact. It's a no. Not happening. Don't pursue it. And when Meghan read that message, alone in her Montecito office, surrounded by vision boards, scripts in development, pending trademarks, and next step plans, she reportedly sat very, very still. This was more than a scheduling conflict, more than a political inconvenience. This was symbolic erasure. Australia had once been her stage, the tour where the world met Duchess Meghan, radiant, pregnant, walking beside her prince in the sunshine. It was where she won hearts without trying, where she first glimpsed the power of being adored not just as Harry's wife, but as Meghan Markle, the Duchess with a purpose. She had whispered secrets to schoolgirls, held crying mothers, hugged disabled veterans, danced barefoot with Indigenous elders. And now, that stage was off limits. According to someone in Meghan's circle, a friend who had worked with her on prior charitable projects, the Duchess took it harder than she let on. At first, she tried to spin it. "They're just not ready," she reportedly said. "The timing's not right. We'll circle back next year." But even as the words left her lips, she knew they rang hollow. There wouldn't be a next year. Not for this. Not in Australia. That door had closed. Politely. Permanently. And when she told Harry, he didn't react with fury. He reacted with something worse. Disappointment. For Harry, the rejection cut deeper than political maneuvering. It pierced something raw. Something tied to his mother, Diana. Because he remembered Diana's tour of Australia in 1983. Remembered the photos. The way she connected with people. The way Australians loved her for her vulnerability and unfiltered empathy. Harry had long seen Australia as a link to his mother's spirit. The fact that his family, his wife, was now unwelcome felt like a personal loss. A quiet betrayal by a country he once loved. He reportedly asked one of his old Invictus contacts, "Is it because of me?" The answer? A pause. Then, "It's complicated." And there it was. That's the phrase that haunted the Sussexes from the moment they left the royal family. It's complicated. Not yes. Not no. Just an endless limbo of awkward phone calls, delayed RSVPs, and diplomatic vagueness. Montecito may have brought them freedom, but it also brought them detachment. From the world they once ruled. From the causes they once championed. From the countries that once held them up. Meghan began asking questions. Not publicly. Not yet. But internally. Why now? Why Australia? Why would a progressive, multicultural government reject a tour built around charity, wellness, and community upliftment? The answer she feared was the one that echoed most loudly in private. Because her brand was no longer an asset. It was a liability. Australia didn't want the baggage. The headlines. The drama. The inevitable clickbait that would follow every handshake and photo op. The government couldn't afford the distraction. And Meghan? She couldn't afford the silence. Because this wasn't just about Australia. It was about momentum. For a woman whose life now revolved around controlling the narrative, nothing was more dangerous than stillness. No tours meant no press. No press meant no buzz. And no buzz? No leverage. No power. She turned back to her team. There were talks about pivoting the focus, perhaps producing a documentary about Australia instead. Telling Indigenous stories. Visiting off-the-grid communities as private citizens. But the energy was already off. The door had closed. The magic was gone. And deep down, Meghan knew it. This rejection wasn't just logistical. It was emotional. Because it reminded her of something she didn't want to admit. She was no longer welcome where she once shined brightest. There were whispers that she cried. Not in public. Not even in front of Harry. But alone, late at night. In a room filled with notes, headlines, photos of the past. There was one image, her holding hands with a small Aboriginal girl in Dubbo, both smiling under the rain. That photo used to hang in her home office. It's not there anymore. Instead, there's a new vision board. Hollywood projects, lifestyle ventures, book drafts, deals in development. Meghan is a survivor, if nothing else. She pivots. She reframes. She keeps moving. But Australia? That door stays shut. And no amount of Netflix dollars, Instagram quotes, or podcast episodes could pry it back open. Because Australia didn't cancel them with noise. It canceled them with absence. And that, for Meghan Markle, hurt more than any headline. But just when she began to regroup, to strategize, to shift course. Another surprise hit. And this time, it didn't come from Australia. It came from a streaming giant. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happens when the cameras you once controlled turn against you? For Meghan and Harry, Netflix was supposed to be redemption, a platform to reclaim the narrative, to speak unfiltered, uninterrupted, and unchallenged. No palace press office, no royal constraints, just their truth, raw, polished, cinematic. But truth, once released into the wild, doesn't always behave. And in Australia, a country with a long memory and even longer antennas for spin, that truth landed with a thud. The docuseries Harry and Meghan was billed as a global media event. 6 episodes, exclusive interviews, never-before-seen footage, intimate home videos, and at its center, the couple's side of the story, their version of the exit, their pain, their betrayal, their freedom. In Montecito, the story played like a fairy tale cracked by cruelty. In the US, it sparked debate. In Britain, it caused a storm. But in Australia, it caused something worse. Disappointment. Australians had once rallied behind the Sussexes. They remembered the beach walks, the baby bump reveal, the emotional Invictus speeches. They had invested in the idea of Harry and Meghan. They had cried with them, clapped for them, given them standing ovations. But when they watched the Netflix series, they didn't see heroes. They saw actors. Let's start with the infamous curtsy scene. In one of the most talked-about moments of the series, Meghan dramatically reenacts the deep curtsy she gave Queen Elizabeth during their first meeting, with exaggerated arms and theatrical tone. Harry sits beside her, visibly uncomfortable. She laughs. The audience laughs. But in Australia, the reaction wasn't laughter. It was shock. Because while Republic sentiment simmers in pockets, the monarchy, especially the late Queen, still commands a deep, almost sacred respect in Australian culture. She wasn't just a figurehead. She was stability, continuity, the ultimate public servant. And for many, watching Meghan parody that moment felt not cheeky, but mean-spirited. One Australian journalist wrote, "Mocking your grandmother-in-law, who welcomed you into her family and gave you a title, isn't bravery. It's betrayal in a ball gown." The criticism didn't stop there. Episode after episode, the Sussexes laid out their grievances: racist headlines, hostile palace courtiers, mental health struggles, press persecution. But something about the tone, polished, tightly edited, and soaked in luxury B-roll, left Australians cold. The vulnerability felt rehearsed. The storytelling felt manufactured. The tears were real, perhaps, but framed in a way that felt more scripted than sincere. And for a nation that values blunt honesty over pageantry, the disconnect was jarring. Even allies of the Sussexes, liberal commentators, human rights advocates, progressive voices, hesitated. They wanted to support the message. But the medium? It undermined it. One former Australian MP tweeted after watching the 3rd episode, "If you're going to expose injustice, don't do it from a $14 million mansion while sipping green juice in full makeup." The real damage came not from critics, but from veterans. Harry had always enjoyed unshakable support from Australia's military community. His visits to bases, his Invictus Games leadership, his openness about trauma, it all built goodwill. But the Netflix doc challenged that legacy. When Harry repeatedly discussed his war experiences, including his infamous "I killed 25 Taliban" admission in his memoir, it raised questions. Not just about judgment, but about intent. Australian veterans began speaking out. Some said they felt used. Others questioned why Harry, once a comrade in arms, was now monetizing his pain for content. "We don't talk about our kill count over here," one veteran said on a radio interview. "It's not a badge. It's a burden." And he made it a headline. Even Invictus Australia, the very organization that had once rolled out red carpets for him, began quietly distancing. They remained respectful, yes. But the fire, the warmth, the personal connection, it cooled. Fast. The public noticed. And then came the ratings. Australian viewership of Harry and Meghan started strong. Curious audiences tuned in. But by episode 3, numbers dropped sharply. Social media sentiment analysis revealed a growing trend: skepticism. Words like scripted, tone-deaf, and overproduced spiked. The fairy tale was fracturing. Meghan's speech on privacy versus platform also drew fire. In one scene, she discusses wanting privacy for her family. While walking past a camera crew, mic'd up, her home interiors on full display. Australians don't mind contradiction, but they do mind hypocrisy. One columnist wrote, "You can't demand we respect your private life while giving Netflix a guided tour of your fridge." Ouch. Behind the scenes, Netflix execs were reportedly pleased with the series' global reach. But within diplomatic circles, the tone was different. Australian officials watched closely, not just for entertainment, but to assess risk. Could this couple, now so clearly media-forward, be trusted to navigate a delicate tour? To avoid controversy? To respect boundaries? The answer became clear. If this is what they produce about themselves, what might they say about us? The decision to deny any formal tour request wasn't made in isolation. The Netflix doc was Exhibit A, proof, to some, that the Sussexes had crossed a line, from dignified ex-royals to highly unpredictable content creators. And for a country managing complex conversations about its own identity, indigenous reconciliation, and constitutional reform, the last thing they needed was a royal reality show in the outback. But perhaps the most telling moment came from an Australian woman, once a die-hard Meghan fan, who posted a TikTok tearfully explaining why she wouldn't watch the final episode. "I believed in her," she said. "I really did. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being about service and started being about screens." That video went viral, and Meghan's team noticed. So did Harry's. There were emergency PR meetings, rebranding suggestions, a proposed Australia Day podcast episode, all shelved. The feedback was too sharp, the sting too fresh. And still, Montecito was quiet. Because what could they say? Australia had once written their origin story, and now it had closed the book. But just when it seemed like the backlash had peaked, a new revelation emerged. Not from Netflix, not from the press, but from Meghan herself. A letter, a plea. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What does desperation look like when it's wrapped in royal stationery? For someone who has long championed the power of narrative, of curated messages, of elegant diplomacy cloaked in modern branding, Meghan Markle's next move wasn't broadcast. It wasn't filmed, filtered, or made into a glossy podcast special. It was personal. It was private. And, ironically, it may have been her most revealing act yet. Because what do you do when the doors have closed, the press has turned, and the public that once adored you no longer seems to care? You write. Somewhere between the Netflix fallout and the Australian government's quiet but firm rejection, a letter was composed. Not just any letter. A direct, heartfelt, precisely worded communication, allegedly sent from Meghan's own office to several key figures in Australia's nonprofit and philanthropic space. It wasn't made public. It wasn't meant to be, but it was real. And soon, it would be leaked. Let's unpack what we know. According to insiders, the letter was not addressed to the government. Meghan, now savvy to protocol, knew that would be inappropriate. Instead, it was positioned as a private expression of interest. A feeler sent to influential leaders in women's advocacy, youth empowerment, and media literacy organizations across Australia. The message? That she and Prince Harry remained deeply committed to causes affecting the Commonwealth, and that they would be honored to explore collaborative opportunities with grassroots and legacy institutions doing impactful work across Australia. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't even a formal proposal. But make no mistake, it was a pitch. A pitch for relevance. For return. For redemption. And for a moment, just a brief, shimmering moment, it seemed like it might work. One of the recipients, a prominent CEO of a Sydney-based women's foundation, was reportedly touched. It was thoughtful, she told a colleague. Measured. She clearly cares. Others echoed the sentiment, noting the respectful tone, the absence of entitlement, the sincerity behind the words. Meghan wasn't demanding a stage. She was requesting a seat at the table. But here's where it unraveled. Because in an age where every message can be forwarded, every sentiment can be screenshot, every whisper can become a headline, the letter didn't stay private. It leaked. First, quietly, to a gossip columnist. Then, inevitably, to national media. And what could have been a moment of reconciliation, a quiet return through purpose, not performance, suddenly became fodder for ridicule. Headlines ran wild. Meghan begs for Aussie invite and is denied again. Leaked letter reveals Duchess's desperation. Private no more. Meghan's secret appeal goes public. It was brutal. The worst part? The contents of the letter, likely written with care, vulnerability, and a genuine desire to reconnect, were stripped of their nuance. Reduced to sound bites. Mocked. Turned into tabloid punchlines. Her words, meant to open hearts, instead opened the floodgates of cynicism. Some mocked her timing. Now you want to come back. After you slammed the monarchy that ties us together? Others questioned her sincerity. How grassroots can you be when you fly private and live in a $14 million mansion? Even some of the very organizations she'd written to began to distance themselves. Quietly, politely. We thank the Duchess for her interest, one group stated in a chilly press release, but we have no plans to pursue collaborative engagements at this time. Translation? Thanks, but no thanks. For Meghan, this wasn't just a PR stumble. It was humiliation, because the one tool she had always relied on, the power of her pen, her voice, her ability to sway hearts and minds with carefully chosen words, had failed her. Or worse, it had backfired. The impact inside Montecito was immediate. Meghan's team went into crisis mode. Phone calls were made. Damage control began. The leak was investigated. Sources suggest it came from someone inside one of the nonprofits, not Meghan's camp. But the damage was done. And Harry? Sources close to the couple say he was furious. Not at Meghan, but at the system, at the press, at Australia, at the endless loop of rejection and ridicule that now seemed to define every attempt at reconnection. We're trying to do good, he allegedly said during a tense conversation. Why does that keep getting twisted? But the answer, as always, is more complicated than anger can reach. Because the world has changed. And Meghan and Harry, for all their fame, no longer control the narrative. Australia's cold shoulder wasn't just political. It was cultural. It reflected a broader exhaustion, not with the Sussexes themselves, but with what they now represented, a drama that never ends, a spotlight that never dims, a message that always seems to have a price tag. And the letter, that last, fragile olive branch, was seen not as grace, but as maneuver. So Meghan pulled back. The media went quiet. And for a brief moment, the world stopped spinning just long enough for her to wonder, was it all slipping away? But even as Meghan grieved the silence, another force was quietly building behind the scenes. One far more personal, far more powerful, and potentially more damaging than any media fallout. Because someone else had been watching, listening, waiting, and they were about to speak. What came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the rejection didn't start in Canberra, but in Kensington? The headlines pointed to the Australian government. The silence, the denial, the refusal to host Meghan and Harry in any formal capacity. But beneath the political niceties and diplomatic distance, there was another player in the shadows. Someone with more influence than most dare admit. Someone whose fingerprints were never publicly traced, but whose silent nod can shape the movement of kings, crowns, and cancelled tours. Prince William. Because behind every closed door in the modern monarchy, behind every sanctioned itinerary, behind every phone call to a Commonwealth official, William's presence is felt. He is, after all, not just the heir apparent. He is the architect of the monarchy's future. And in that future, there is no room for chaos. Let's step back. Since Harry and Meghan's exit in 2020, William has moved strategically. No shouting, no interviews, no documentaries, just quiet, calculated presence. He tightened his circle, restructured his teams, strengthened ties with Commonwealth leaders, and doubled down on loyalty, consistency, and predictability. While Meghan and Harry turned their post-royal life into a series of unpredictable headline cycles, William leaned into something different: institutional power. So when whispers began to swirl in late 2023 that Meghan and Harry were looking to return to Australia, even unofficially, you can be sure William heard them. Fast. According to senior royal sources, there was immediate concern. Not outrage, not panic, but firm concern. Because Australia isn't just another Commonwealth nation. It's strategic, it's symbolic, and more importantly, it's contested. With rumblings of a Republican referendum rising again, the palace needs to play its hand carefully. William and Catherine are expected to visit Australia within the next 2 years, possibly even representing the king directly. And that visit is expected to be calm, unifying, elegant, the very image of monarchy renewed. The last thing William wanted? A Sussex circus destabilizing that message. Sources suggest that a call, or more likely, a quiet briefing, was made from Kensington Palace to key intermediaries in Australia. Not to block Meghan and Harry explicitly. That would be improper. But to make preferences clear. Very clear. Royals who are no longer working members, the message reportedly stated, do not carry the endorsement of the palace for official engagements. That's it. No threats. No vetoes. Just policy. And it was enough. Because in diplomatic circles, subtlety is currency. Australia understood. Hosting Meghan and Harry, even unofficially, would place them at odds with the very institution they were meant to be allied with. And with Prince William preparing for his own ascension as a global statesman, alienating him over two ex-royals simply wasn't worth the risk. But this wasn't just a political play. It was personal. William hasn't forgotten Australia 2018. He remembers watching the Sussex tour from London, the headlines, the crowds, the glow. He remembers how Harry and Meghan dominated the narrative, how the press compared their ease and glamour to his and Catherine's more subdued public style. The subtext was obvious. Meghan was fresh, relatable, iconic. Kate was outdated, reserved, duty-bound. The contrast stung. And while William never said a word in public, he didn't have to. Behind the scenes, he made a decision. Protect the institution. Recenter the narrative. Make sure the monarchy didn't spin out again. So when Harry and Meghan floated their unofficial return, William saw not an opportunity, but a threat. A threat to stability. A threat to message control. A threat to his reign. Because make no mistake, William is already ruling. Quietly. Strategically. With King Charles's health casting a long shadow, and the monarchy entering its most fragile transition in decades, William's word carries weight. And when he leans on a government, even through intermediaries, they listen. Australia listened. Meghan and Harry were quietly shut out. And William? He said nothing. Because for William, silence is power. And this isn't the first time he's used it. Sources close to the palace recall another moment, not long after Harry and Meghan's Netflix series aired, when William was asked in a private meeting if he would consider responding to any of the allegations. His reply? They'll run out of stories before we run out of silence. That's not coldness. That's calculation. William doesn't fight back. He waits. He outlasts. And when necessary, he blocks. This wasn't vengeance. It was maintenance. A future king protecting his chessboard. And on that board, Australia is a key square. One he's not willing to cede to a player who walked away from the game. Meghan, upon hearing this theory, that William's influence may have shaped the outcome, reportedly dismissed it. That's not how diplomacy works, she told a friend. He wouldn't stoop to that. But Harry? Harry wasn't so sure. He knows his brother, knows how he moves, knows that while William rarely speaks out, his shadow falls long. And the realization cut deeper than Harry expected. Because for Harry, Australia wasn't just another Commonwealth gig. It was one of the last places where his own identity, separate from William, had been celebrated. A place where he was the headline. Not the spare, not the sidekick, but the center. Now, that space is being recaptured, reclaimed, by William, and soon, if rumors are true, by Catherine as well. There's talk of a future Australia tour led by the new Prince and Princess of Wales. Quiet meetings, travel planners engaged, venues reviewed, a grand, carefully coordinated royal charm offensive to shore up support in a shifting political climate. And when it happens, there will be no room for distraction, no tolerance for overshadowing. The Sussexes won't be mentioned. They won't be invited. They won't even be referenced. They will be ghosted. And for Meghan and Harry, watching from afar, excluded from the very stage they once ruled, that silence will speak louder than any press release. But just as William quietly locked the gate, Harry looked backward, to a memory still burning inside him. Because Australia didn't just belong to Meghan's rise. It belonged to Diana's. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if a rejection isn't just political, but ancestral? For Prince Harry, the pain of Australia's cold shoulder runs deeper than headlines or protocol. It isn't just about denied tours or silent schedules. It's about legacy, memory, a ghost that's never left him. Because long before Meghan ever touched down in Sydney, long before Harry became a husband, a father, or a renegade royal, there was her, Diana, and Australia was hers. The year was 1983. Diana, just 21, newly married, uncertain, and delicate, stepped into the blinding heat of the Australian sun on her first overseas royal tour with Prince Charles. She was nervous, out of place, and visibly overwhelmed. But within days, she became a phenomenon. Crowds surged. People screamed her name. Cameras flashed. And something unexpected happened. The people connected with her. They saw not a princess on a pedestal, but a young woman trying, faltering, and eventually rising. A woman who shook hands with the sick, crouched down to meet children eye to eye, wore locally made clothes, and smiled, not with royal stiffness, but with human warmth. Diana didn't just visit Australia. She claimed it. The tour changed everything. For her, for Charles, and for the monarchy. It was the moment when the world realized that the people's princess had arrived. And for young Harry, watching those tapes years later, it became a symbol of something sacred. His mother's ability to reach people, to see